Good morning, one and all present. It is my utmost pleasure and gratitude to invite all of you to the 19th International Science Fiction Conference, jointly organized by the Bangalore University and Indian Association of Science Fiction, Bangalore. It is my utmost pleasure to heartily welcome one and all present here. I would like to welcome our principals, Professor Dr. Suresh V. Nadugowda, sir, Professor Dr. V. Sudesh, former Principal and Dean, University Law College and Department of Studies, Bangalore University, Professor N. Dashrath, Chairman and Dean, Faculty of Law, University Law College and Department of Studies, Bangalore University. Dr. Satish Gowda N., Assistant Professor, University Law College and Department of Studies, Bangalore University. Dr. Jyoti Vishwanath, Assistant Professor, University Law College and Department of Studies, Bangalore University. And Dr. Chandrakanti L., Assistant Professor, University Law College and Department of Studies, Bangalore University. It is my utmost pleasure to welcome today's distinguished speaker, Professor Kirin Tranter. Now I would like Professor Dr. V. Sudesa to do a welcome address for our invitee.
Okay, thank you, Rachita. This is a formal protocol that I need to, as a coordinator, welcome all those present here. Good noon to all. I think it is good evening to Professor Kirin Tranter. In Queensland, it must be around 5 o'clock in the evening. Yeah. Dear Principal, the Dean, and my dear colleagues, I'm happy to invite you all to listen to a special lecture by Professor Kirin Tranter, Chair of Law, Technology and Future, School of Law, Queensland University of Technology, Australia. Sir, I extend you a warm welcome on behalf of Bangalore University, especially on behalf of University Law College and Department of Studies in Law. I think all my students, including myself, my members of the faculty, all are excited to listen to you. I especially thank you because I just came to know that you're actually not well in terms of physical mobility. But despite that, I can understand your commitment to the cause of spreading education, the cause of sharing knowledge. Don't mind, sir. India and Australia have drawn level as far as the one-day match and the T20 matches are concerned. You won the one-day match and we won the T20 match. Let's hope we'll have a better luck insofar as the test match is concerned. Thank you, sir. I take this opportunity to welcome all my dear colleagues, including the most hardworking dear colleague of mine, the young and dynamic Dr. N. Satish Gowda, who has been running behind the scene to get things done. Welcome to you, Dr. Satish Gowda. My dearest colleagues, Dr. Chandrakanti, Dr. Jyoti Vishwanath, the other dean, the Dean Faculty of Law, Dr. Dashrath, is actually attending another parallel session elsewhere. So he's unable to join, but he has conveyed his good wishes to you all. May I welcome all my esteemed students, my LLB students, my LLM students, my research scholars. This is once in a lifetime opportunity to listen to a person who is exclusively devoted his entire research work on law, science, and technology. May I inform you, sir, our Vice Chancellor is another parallel session. He has conveyed his greetings to you. He will be joining mid-course and we'll also listen to him. Thank you very much. And with this, I hand over the platform to Rachita once again.
Thank you, sir. Now I welcome our guest speaker, Professor Kirin Tranter, Chair of Law, Technology and Future, School of Law, Queensland University of Technology, Australia. Professor Kirin has taught extensively into the LLB curriculum at law schools in Queensland and Western Australia. His teaching areas have been administrative law, civil procedure, and legal theory. He has taught electives in clinical legal education, law and culture, and law reform. Professor Kirin has many publications in international journals like International Journal for Semantics of Law, Griffith Law Review, University of Western Australia Law Review, Oxford Journal of Legal Studies, to name a few. He has been awarded a group learning and teaching citation by Griffith University for his leadership and law reform elective that facilitated students in developing experience in research impact through the drafting experience and submitting of reform submissions. He previously was awarded a group learning and teaching citation by Griffith University in 2011 for his leadership of the team that successfully redesigned and taught the legal theory courses to address student engagement and satisfaction concerns. Professor Kirin is currently the Chair of Law, Technology and Future in the School of Law. He is also the founding general editor of Law, Technology and Humans. In researching law, technology, and future, his research often engages with cultural narratives that connect humans, law, and technology, and past configurations of humans, law, and technology. The goal of his research is to guide and shape humanity's technological future to be better than its technological past. The paper that he will be talking in the present session is Legalities of the Present of the Barn and Hope in Star Trek Picard. Now I hand over the platform to Professor Kirin Tranter to discuss about his paper. Thank you, sir.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much to my learned colleagues and professors, to my soon-to-be good friends in India. I'm incredibly grateful for the opportunity to be with you today. I have spent over 2 decades researching law and technology. And one of the really critical things we need to do and take note of and think seriously about when we research law and technology is to understand the importance of the science fiction imaginative on how science fiction has given us a way of dreaming and thinking about futures with technology, normally often futures that are full of danger, sometimes full of hope and promise. But we cannot regulate technology. We can't even imagine future technologies without acknowledging the importance of science fiction as a storehouse, a repository of images, narratives, and tropes for how technology and humans could come together, do come together, and the dangers and the possibilities of that coming together. So I've spent a lot of time, and so I'm really excited to be talking to you today within the context of a conference that's about science fiction. In my most recent book, Living with Technical Legality, which was published by Embry University in 2018, I wrote about how science fiction is so important to imagining not just technological futures, but in fact, all of law's future. That in a lot of science fictions, there were ideas that ran beyond just surface concerns with, say, robots or space travel or biotechnology, but fundamental concerns with the human condition, with what it means to live in the human collective, what it means to live in a human collective governed by rules and norms. The paper I'm presenting today, or a part of it today, continues that trajectory of research, of trying to think seriously about our present and our future, and the questions of law that come with our present and our future through and with science fiction and science fiction imaginaries. This paper was actually commissioned from me by the University of Queensland earlier in the year. And what they asked is they wanted a piece that reflected on 2020. 2020, as I know from my colleagues that I work with in India, as we know from we watch our various screens, has been an incredibly difficult year. In Australia, it began with a terrible bushfires, the worst on season, indication of dramatic climate change leading to such catastrophic bushfires. We then very quickly led into the COVID pandemic, which fortunately for us in Australia has not been as dramatic as other parts of the world, but still has had a tremendous impact on us personally, economically, and because we're such a connected community, we all have friends and relations and relatives and colleagues in countries that are also still very affected by it. One of the other big issues that have come in 2020 has been, of course, particularly in America and also in Australia, a real emphasis and rethinking about policing, race, and the underlying cultural narrative that have led to, particularly in the last 30 years, very strong policing and racialized policing of certain minority groups in particularly these Western countries, and the technologies that are used to identify, augment. So also something that happened in 2020, and from a completely science fiction perspective, was for people who really like Star Trek, we got a whole new Star Trek TV show. Yes, I'm Australian. I know Star Trek is American, but Star Trek occupies a really important place in particularly the global West, and an important place and a fundamental place in any analysis of science fiction. Star Trek is important because it's one of the few science fictions that, at its best, portrays humanity at its best. And often, and this is why there's a very large secondary academic literature around Star Trek, it is, at its best, Star Trek is always a story of hope. So what is interesting is that in 2020, a year that seemed for many rather hopeless, we had streamed to us by Amazon Prime a brand new Star Trek story, but not just any new Star Trek story, a Star Trek story that revisited one of the often the most important character, at least in the last 30 years of Star Trek, which was the captain of the USS Enterprise, Mark D, from the Star Trek Next Generation series, Jean-Luc Picard. The revisiting of this character now, visiting this character and a return to a 10-episode story about this character's life 20 years after we last saw him piloting a starship is an interesting juxtaposition to the hopelessness that we see in 2020. Because Picard, as identified in a lot of the secondary literature about Star Trek, and included a lot of the legal secondary literature. So one of the really fun things about writing about Star Trek is that there are a whole pile of legal academic journal articles that talk about the law in Star Trek, either take it seriously, law and literature approach, looking at the types of legality, the types of forms of law, or more like the work I do, using Star Trek as a metaphor, as an exemplar, as an imaginary for critical issues of law that exist in our society. So there's this literature out there. Common in that literature is a strong recognition that Jean-Luc Picard is an exemplar of what we would call charismatic and bureaucratic, to use Weber's term, leadership. He had a role of captain, but he had also earned that role and been respected in that role and seen as a leader that people could follow, believe in, and in that following and believe in, make the world a better place. We have too often seen with populist leaders around the world, people who build followers through hate, through division, and what we see in Picard in the earlier Next Generation series, back in the 80s and the 90s, a leader that tried to bring people together through cosmopolitan community, respect of others, communication, rule of law, and these values that we associate with the rule-based legal order that many of us see as very, very important to a positive and healthy community, both nationally, locally, and globally. So 2020 being a fairly miserable year, one of the highlights was this revisiting of what was a very positive character, Jean-Luc Picard. One of the paper is in three parts. The first part of it just does a sort of a location of this new set of stories within the Star Trek canon and within the secondary literature about Star Trek. What is interesting about this 10-episode stories is firstly, it's not like traditional television that's very episodic. It's more like a very large movie or a mini series. It's sort of got a central story that unfolds over the 10 episodes. We're seeing that a lot in the remaking of television through the streaming services, where we're going from very episodic shows to much longer, slower moving storytelling, sort of mini-series style storytelling with sort of cross-season narratives and images and tropes. And Picard was very much in that characteristic. So it's meant to be binged in 10 hours. You're meant to sit down and watch the lot of it. And each story interconnects with the other story. That's very different to the original 7 seasons and 150 episodes of Star Trek Next Generation. That was mostly episodic. You know, there would be a different story arc within the structure of the story, of the overarching meta narrative of the story each episode. The second thing that was most striking about Picard is it's set 20 years after the last movie that had the Next Generation crew, which was Star Trek Nemesis. So it's made itself 20 years later, and it's set into text inside the story 20 years later. Picard's no longer a captain in Starfleet. He's retired. He became an admiral. He's retired. He's living a fairly comfortable life on his ancestral French vineyard, which looks like a very, very nice place to be. We also get an impression that the Federation, the collective political entity that the Earth leads, of which Starfleet is the military / police / exploratory science agency of, hasn't had a very good last 20 years. We've seen that there was a major terrorist attack on Mars that has led to Federation and Starfleet turning inwards. So where we have in the original TV show a culture looking out into the universe, engaging, exploring, leading the galaxy, we see 20 years later in this show a world turned inwards, a world concerned about a catastrophic terrorist attack that has led to the world turning inwards. We see this suddenly, of course, prefigures one thing. It clearly prefigures the history of the global West. There is an obvious referencing to 9/11 and the shift that we've seen in US leadership of the global West from, the 90s, the world community focus through to a much more turning inwards, closing off. The story over the 10 episodes is quite interesting. The story concerns the slow discovery of a small group of androids. Brief interlude here. In the Star Trek universe, if you are any great fan, on the Star Trek Next Generation crew, one of the favorite characters was an android deck officer who was really, really unimaginatively named Data. The thing about Data was that in this universe, he was the first type of a really human android synthesis type being, the most convincing of it. And as the narrative goes, he was one of a kind. And when he dies in the Nemesis movie 20 years previously to this story, it was considered the end of that sort of artificial synthetic life that he represented. So more than just a robot, really a form of human created life form, existent life. The narrative in Star Trek Picard is essentially the discovery that various rogue scientists had managed to keep alive the science and the technology behind Data and had founded a colony of these type of androids. Now, in science fiction, robots and androids always sign or signify questions of slavery. Embedded in the Czech word robot from the foundational text Are You Ard. Robot comes from the Czech and from the play Are You Ard by the Brothers Kopeck. Robot means worker. And there's always, most robot stories, from Asimov stories onwards, from Astro Boy comics in Japan from the 1950s, there's always the threat and the scare and the legalities and the human rights issues and the jurisprudence of slavery tied up. The other thing always tied up in robots, which we see in the other great narrative, what we see in RUR itself, is robots threaten to overtake and replace humans. So the robot as homicidal, as out to get them, replace the humans. And look, we see that narrative every day, particularly when we see discussions about automation and AI replacing people's jobs. And so it's one of the tropes about robots that keeps coming back. So we have in this Star Trek Picard story two immediate issues around law. One, we have this founding anxiety about this massive terrorist attack. This connects with robots because it was attempts to build androids like Commander Data that were used, that went rogue and caused this attack. So we suddenly have the explanation for this changed world that Picard goes into of a founding, what I called in the paper, the ban. A ban is a prohibition. And often in jurisprudence and often in fundamental storytelling, we justify the existence of a world and the existence of a social order through articulation of a ban. A ban is something is prohibited. One of the best examples from the deep stories in Western culture is Sigmund Freud's story version of the foundation of the social contract, which was based on the primordial horde controlled by the father with his sons, and the sons agree amongst themselves to murder the father in order to achieve sexual independence. The sons then immediately regret this. It then forms a ban on homicide, and it forms a very restricted community. So the trauma of the murder of the father founds a legality. And we're seeing that in Star Trek Picard. The trauma of this massive terrorist attack, it happened to be on Mars, caused by the android, but founds a ban, which is the banning of research into androids and synthetic life, that leads to the Federation becoming a much more enclosed community. So in Star Trek Picard, once he finally gets off Earth and starts finding himself a crew and flies around the universe is a lot more lawless than it was in 20 years earlier in The Next Generation. There are areas that the Federation has abandoned to, black marketeers, warlords, where we didn't see that sort of absence of normative order in Star Trek Next Generation. So the story is he finds this community. We discover this community is under threat by one of the good old baddies from Star Trek, the Romulans. We see various things happen in adventures, but there's ultimately a crisis. In the crisis, two things can happen. One way the crisis is resolved when there are societies based on the ban, often what happens is that it's a timeless world. The ban is based on a trauma. The ban exists, causes more trauma. The trauma ends in crisis. The crisis then gets resolved itself by the foundation of another ban, which leads to then trauma. The cycle is repeated again and again. We see that with the Romulans, which the story unfolds in the TV show, that they have this fundamental belief in synthetic life rising up and killing humans, that they aggressively hunt it down. And of course, in the hunting down of the robots resist and attack the humans. So the hate, the aggression, the action to enforce the ban gives rise to its trauma, that gives rise to its challenge. This is not, this is very much, understandable, the understandable world of the present. We have a world where places of privilege are feeling under threat because of COVID, under threat because of racial minorities, under threat because the global economy is changing. They're looking back. They're wanting to make America great again. They're wanting to reimagine Britain as part of empire and not attached to Europe. It's our friends in China wanting to reclaim the territories lost during the colonial periods, or asserting that. It's a looking backwards to a period before the trauma event and a turning inwards. It's this jurisprudence leading rise to conservative inward-looking communities that we're seeing played out in the world, and we're also seeing played out in Star Trek Picard. But in Picard, the climax point doesn't end in a repeat of the trauma. In classic Star Trek mode, complete with playing the tunes of the original Star Trek Next Generation theme song, which is sort of uplifting and orchestral, Picard does something different. He leads by putting himself in harm's way. He actually dies, sacrifices himself in order to try to stop the Romulans who are about to attack the planet of androids, the androids who are about to contact another group of androids who are going to come and rain death and destruction onto this universe. He intervenes and tries something different. And in doing so, there's a pause and the parties decide to go somewhere different. Eventually, the story ends up quite positively, even though Picard dies, which is often the case in science fiction. People die all the time. Luckily, we have fantastic technologies to resurrect them, and which is what happens in Star Trek Picard. He gets resurrected in an android body that looks just like his existing body. So conveniently, we can have a season 2 now. The Federation finally decides to intervene, recognizes the androids as a first contact situation, decides to include them or put them under their protection, and scares off the Romulans. And there is talk of a new community. The ban is replaced, and this cosmopolitan community that Star Trek is known for reasserts itself. We have a story of leadership. We have this very obvious desire of an American TV show for actually a leader that leads, that brings people together, that intercedes, that stands up. And nothing for many people, nothing demonstrates the desires and fantasies of many people in 2020 is for that sort of leadership that breaks with the hate, breaks with the violence, and tries to lead people by bringing people together. But not exactly. And this is the sting in the tail. Space operas, of which Star Trek, like Star Wars, is part of, are closely tied in their tradition to the English naval romances, the Hornblowers, the penny naval romances of the 19th century about, people in ships going to ports and fighting wars and having explorations and experiences. This is really, space opera is very, very similar. What that means is that these are also military ships. There's a gunboat diplomacy. This new future, this hope that is secured by Picard in the end of this first season of this story is only achieved because suddenly the Federation's military might appears out of nowhere and secures at the last minute, intervenes, scares the Romulans off, declares these people are now under a certain treaty, protected, and allows the space for this community to keep on living. So there's, at one level, this is a great story about leadership. Another level, it's also tied to techno-military might. And that's the thing in the tail of the story. Leadership is all words if it's not backed up by force, which undermines, at one level, some of the positive story of hope that comes from it. But this was always the issue with Star Trek criticism has always pointed this out. It is ultimately America visioning itself. And in doing so, vision itself as the bearer of rights, the bearer of legal order to the world, the bearer of a non-imperial imperialism. But parallel to that, it's also backed by a techno-military superiority that declares itself in the world. So, that's sort of a summary of this paper. The paper's coming out in a publication called Pandora's Box early next year. As I said, it was a plotted summary. I'm a firm believer in chatting to people. So I'd like to sort of end my symbiosis of my paper at this point and invite people to ask questions or engage. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor. That was indeed really a very interesting and exciting juxtaposition of Star Trek over the real world and the legal issues. And I, to some extent, agree with you that the Star Trek 2, the new season, is almost similarly being played between different nations. I'm very interested I'm attracted to your statement that America being non-imperialist yet being imperialist in the sense of its military superiority or other kinds of edge that it has got over other countries. Over to you, Rachita. Any questions?
The platform is open for any discussion. If participants want to ask any questions, they can put it in the chat box. So it will be asked in this session.
They can directly ask, unmute themselves if they want to ask.
There is a question asked.
Yeah, please.
With current advancements in technology, wherein in the past 100 years have skyrocketed, law more often than not lags behind and tries to curb excessive misuse, but can also lead to stifling technology. How can we meet a middle ground?
Look, that's always a fantastic question. So, firstly, I like answering this question two ways. One way is take that as an empirical hypothesis. Does law lag behind? Yes, no, and it's really fascinating. There are some situations where there has been technological advances, or it's not really the technology; it's technology facilitating social use, which is, we decide needs legal regulation or is outside of legal regulation, or there is something about that requires legal intervention. So there's some really classic examples of that happening, and therefore the need for law to catch up. There's also some fantastic examples of the reverse happening, of law being way ahead. A great example of that is in Australia here, when Dolly the sheep came along in 1997, which is the first example of mammalian cloning. A lot of people said, oh my God, we need laws to ban human reproductive cloning based on this technology. Except in a number of jurisdictions, including in Australia, we had jurisdictions that actually had already banned human cloning. We're actually ahead. But there are some really great examples of law being a long way behind the technology. A classic example is the disruption that occurred in the global north in the second half of last decade when the ride services emerged, and completely, the use of this technology and the ability to connect, private vehicles to fare-paying passengers completely obliterated the then taxi industries and the regulations around that. And that was a clear example that it just took us by surprise. We then struggled to catch up. So, there are examples of law having to catch up. There's examples of law being ahead. The question is, what do we do about it? And that becomes a really, really interesting and tricky question. One way we approach that, and the way that we approach it in Australia and to a degree in India, and any of the Commonwealth jurisdictions that have inherited a model of law reform, is we have a very rational, dare I say, technical process of doing inquiries, of doing investigations, of doing research, and then having that feed into legislative change, and more often legislative regulatory change. And this model, which is familiar from the Law Reform Commission model that began in the UK and has been filtered out through other Commonwealth countries. We in Australia use this across all that model, not just in law reform, but in all sorts of policy and technological regulatory environments, to put in place frameworks, to get expert opinions, to get engagement from stakeholders, to put in place frameworks to facilitate technological opportunities while minimizing technological risks. So I see a lot of, so for example, autonomous vehicles, I've done a fair bit of work on. We're seeing a lot of work done in that space of this sort of report, engagement of experts, technical planning, leading to legislative reform. So we're not worried about the courts. We're sidelining the courts and the common law. We're putting in place regulatory structures based on what we see as the best possible practice at this time. And what's remarkable there is, regardless of the the level of antagonism we might see that exists in the legislature, often the outputs of these inquiries tends to be very politically neutral and tends to be quite respected and tends to get passed into law with support of both. With generally support from the across the political spectrum. So we're seeing, a lot of places are doing things like that. The final one is that sometimes, our anxieties around technology are misplaced, and it's possibly best to wait and see. Now the drama is where do we draw that line? It turned out with Dolly the sheep technology that the anxieties around human cloning have not come to pass. It hasn't come to pass because there's now prohibitions in most nations on human cloning. It hasn't come to pass because there's just no market for it. People aren't interested in using that technology, and the technology involves a very high cost in the sense that you need so many fetuses essentially in order to achieve one healthy offspring, that it just hasn't been yet a technology that has become mainstream that really needs any thinking about. So our legislative attempts about Dolly 23 years ago to prohibit human cloning weren't needed because the technology didn't unfold in the way that we had dreamed it would, based on science fictions and clonings and the Boys from Brazil story and the Brave New World that picture human cloning as an everyday thing. It hasn't come to pass yet. So the answer is we need you guys to research, to think, and to write. That's the important thing. There's not one model fits all. There's not one app. So I have a lot of colleagues around the world who we work on the general theory of law and technology. And our answer to the general theory of law and technology is that there isn't one, that what we need is detailed knowledge of how laws and technologies and societies and cultures interrelate, and from that build up grounded, informed, and nuanced accounts. Different technologies will work in different communities differently. For example, I'm doing a big study at the moment on the way of global platforms rolling out in sub-Saharan Africa. So sub-Saharan Africa, in the last 5 years, we've suddenly got 4G phone towers everywhere and really cheap smartphones. We're dealing with communities that do not have running water, do not have anything else, but they now have access to the digital technology and the global, social media and things like that. The impact of that in those communities is really different to the impact of, say, the next generation iPhone in my community. It's going to have very different outcomes. So we can't. There are going to be some things that are similar and some things that are different. We need research. We cannot assume what happened in California, what happened in Australia is what's going to happen. What's happening in India, what's happening in sub-Saharan Africa. So plead to you people, do research, do theses, do studies, be detailed, and get us a real understanding about how technology, law, and culture and society are interplaying.
Thank you, sir. There is one more question asked. In view of a prospective advent of cyborgs and electronic body modifications in near future, wherein a hacker can direct that electronic prosthetic to do things against a person's conscience, will the law catch on it with it, since there will be a dilemma with respect to the application of principles of natural justice?
Yeah, look, fantastic question. The cyborg's a fantastic imaginative character, because the cyborg is not a robot, it's not a human, it's a hybrid of both. It's the machine in the body, and the body in the machine, which is a wonderful, provocative image, used in particular by a really great theorist of technology, Donna Haraway, in the 1980s, particularly to talk about women and technology, and the experience of technology that women have and the opportunities of technology that women have. So the cyborgs are fantastic science fiction imagery, imaginary that we use all the time. Now, the concept of neural enhancement or neural neural linked cybernetic enhancements is fascinating. So the idea that we can, and we are, and I actually have a colleague at QUT, this is exactly his research. If we now have the ability to interface directly with a machine using essentially a Bluetooth or internet-enabled device hardwired into our neurons, and therefore by thinking, we can make, you know, a car, a vehicle work on the street, or a robotic arm move, whether it's attached to our body or it could be anywhere. What does that do for notions of intention? What are that, you know, these classic notions in law that are based upon the organic human? The organic human has an intention to do something and something happens. What happens where there is now technological intercedence in intention and doing, that the human body is now only part of that story? That's a fantastic question. The answer is, I don't know, except I do. Autonomous vehicles. So we're seeing a lot literature around about the increasing automation of passenger vehicles. And, you know, not only is the Teslas and the Audis and the high-end vehicles increasingly autonomous, but even your more accessible vehicles are getting increasingly computer controlled, you know, automatic braking, hybrid cruise control. There's increasing smarts around vehicles, even if it's not the autopilot enabled Tesla. So we're seeing a lot around autonomous vehicles. And one of the great dilemmas of that is an autonomous vehicle, things are going to go wrong. Someone gets injured, the question becomes, who's liable? So we have a negligence model, and it's deeply in human nature that we always try to pick a blame and pin blame on someone. Although the answer with, if it's an automated vehicle, who's to blame, becomes more complicated. Is it the operator who should have intervened to stop the car doing something silly? Is it the software manufacturer? Is it the manufacturer of the vehicle as a whole who made the mistake that led to this accident? Is it maybe the person who built the code? Is it the LiDAR, the laser sensors that predominantly these vehicles use? Was there something wrong with that hardware? You know, there suddenly becomes, you know, in the olden days of more simple vehicles, we had the driver, he was responsible. 98% of the time, it was driver error led to the accident. We could pin blame easily. We could have a negligence model of dealing with the harms come from that accident. Once we start having autonomous vehicles, or once we start having neuro implants, we suddenly have got all these levels of other parties who have been involved in the process, who provided the technology, the hardware and the software, who've interceded in that. There's a really easy solution. We just go to a no-fault model. So we're seeing, for example, in Australia, when it comes to motor vehicle accidents, we inherently were moving towards abolishing negligence and going to a no-fault model, and we're seeing the acceleration of no-fault, a common contribution, set insurance scheme, where if you're injured by a motor vehicle, you receive redress. There is no question of fault. There's none of that sort of old language of the English common law at play anymore in how we get legal redress from those sort of accidents. So I suspect one of the ways forward here is to abandon these old English notions of intentionality, intent, and these legal concepts that deal with, they're semi-moral concepts of responsibility, and we move to much more socially wide, structured ways of proportioning risk to ensure then if people are harmed, there's adequate compensation, and when we're dealing with trying to get better designs and redress, we deal with that through other ways, design standards, and or criminal law if things have gone very, very wrong. So the answer here is, it's a really fascinating question. Questions of liability are only one way, and an old-fashioned English way to deal with fault and liability and compensation for harms. Maybe there are better models in some areas.
Okay.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
Yeah, Rachita. We have
Yes, sir.
Professor Kirin Tranter. We have our Honorable Vice Chancellor, Professor Dr. K.R. Venugopal, sir, who, despite being busy in attending several parallel sessions, has made it possible to grace this occasion. Over to you, sir.
So good morning to all of you.
Good
I am
morning,
very
sir.
happy.
Namaste, sir.
Namaste. I am
Yes.
very happy that Kirin Tranter, Chair of Law, Technology and Future, has been sharing his expertise and also knowledge and experience with the Bangalore University on the occasion of the 5th International Science Fiction Conference. Thank you very much, sir, for being with us today. I was listening to you for the last 5-10 minutes, and I'm blessed to listen to your discourse. And it is one thing that I was not able to listen to your first part of your lecture, and having listened to the last part, I'm really thrilled, and I think it is eye-opener to as to what the future of law practice and how the science and technology will change the course of law profession in this entire world. So to come, yesterday I was talking at the other seminar where I used to tell that the judges, lawyers, advocates, attorney general, clients are all will be digitized. So how do you transform from the reality to virtuality, and how you're going to make that virtual a real experience? And that's what we are seeing, that you are talking from your own state somewhere thousands of kilometers away, and you're listening to me. And this is how judges across the world will listen to every case that is very important. Maybe the international courts at Hague will be seeing all the people participating from all the countries listening to a particular case, and it will be a rich and enterprising experience to everybody. Now, when you say, when you are talking about the insurance companies are going to change, because when you have a robo lawyer, when you have a robo client, and if you meet with an accident somewhere in Australia, it will be dispersed in India. The insurance, this type of global transformation will take place in future. So we will move on to what is called the physical people, to a paperless world and to a digital world where decision making will be taken from the soft library that is available. So you take case after case, and if you just try to present it to exactly matches a case, you will give the same decision across the world. That type of global global cooperation will take place in the law of jurisprudence and also in the profession of law. So when you come to the digital library, this digital library will be available across the world. Judgments which are given by the judges across the world will be also, put in archives. This can be accessed at any moment, at any time, and by anyone. And that way, the process of giving judgment will hasten, and we'll have a speedy justice, dispersal of justice. We always have seen that justice denied and justice hurried and justice buried. Now we have come, justice hurried and justice will be given. So it is not buried, justice hurried is not justice buried. You get justice instantaneously, just like you can have an insurance claim instantly instead of waiting for years. So in the same way, any case, for example, a property case takes about 20 to 30 years to be decided. But now we can expect with the online, with the onslaught of the digitalization, the way we are conducting our law profession, filing objections and also arguments, and also having your final judgment outcomes, all this will be digitized, and therefore will move from the the path of delayed being instant. So somebody said, justice delayed is justice denied. Justice hurried is justice buried. All these concepts will change with the present digitization of law profession. I should not take much time, because there is no geographical boundaries, there is no cultural boundaries. There is no social boundaries, and there is no even language boundaries for jurisprudence and for law profession in future. And whether there will be a requirement for this law profession, judges and lawyers in future, that is a thing to be addressed. Maybe they will produce robo lawyers and robo judges where they will be sitting and giving on a desktop, and that they will give automatically dispense or give justice to all those people who are involved in litigation. So Kiran, Tranter, I'm very glad that I have been able to listen to you, and it is a wonderful experience that the Bangalore University has been able to, have the honor and have you here at Bangalore University Law College, and we hope that you come visit Bangalore University sometime later after the subsiding of this COVID pandemic, so that we'll be able to harness and benefit from out of your rich and vast experience. I thank again the University Law College for conducting this wonderful International Science Fiction Conference, and congratulate Suresh Nadagaudar, Professor V. Sudesh, who is organizer of this conference, and Professor Dasharath, Dean and Chairperson of Department of Law, and Satish Gowda, and the young faculty Satish Gowda, Chandrakanti, and Jyoti Venkatesh for their presence, and all the alumni and the students who have made it, that made this program as successful and a long-lasting and a milestone in the annals of Bangalore University. Thank you, one and all.
Thank you, sir. Thank you very much for gracing the occasion and your kind remarks.
Over to you, Rachita.
Thank you.
Yes, sir. Now I would like to start with a vote of thanks. Honorable Vice Chancellor, Professor K.R. Venugopal, sir, respected Professor Kirin Tranter, our most valued invited guests, ladies and gentlemen. It's my privilege to have been asked to propose a vote of thanks on this occasion. I, on behalf of University Law College and Department of Studies, Bangalore University, and on my behalf, extend a very hearty vote of thanks to all the speakers for gracing your important work and sharing your findings and opinions with us today. Thank you, sir. I would like to thank Professor Kirin Tranter for spending his valuable time with us and providing great insight into law, technology, and humans. Thank you very much, sir. We appreciate it a lot. I would like to thank our Honorable Vice Chancellor, Professor K.R. Venugopal, sir, for taking time of his busy schedule to be a part of session. Thank you, sir. I would like to thank our Principal, Professor Suresh V. Nadagaudar, sir, Professors V. Sudesh, former Principal and Dean, Department of Studies and Law, Bangalore University, Professor Satish Gowda, sir, Professor Chandrakanti L, and Professor Jyoti Vishwanath, Assistant Professors, University of Law and Department of Studies, Bangalore University, Bangalore. Thank you, all of you, for being a part of this session and sharing your opinions and questions and making this a session very fruitful. Thank you a lot.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Rachita.
Thank you, Professor. Thank you very much. Thank you, sir.